Manufacturing Consent, which incidentally was co-produced with the oversight and cooperation, and I presume funding of the Canada's Film Board, the Film Board of Canada.
National Film Board or something like that.
So Canadians, public funds of Canada went to help support the people who worked so very hard in the construction of this. Wow.
They're Canadian producers, of course.
Yes. All right. We presume there were no corporate American money that went to fund this.
Have to ask them.
Professor Chomsky was introduced, I forget where, Cambridge somewhere, I'm not sure. As the introducer quoted the New York Times as referring to Professor Chomsky as arguably the most important intellectual
in the world.
In the world.
Yes.
To which Professor Chomsky responded.
The line about the arguably the most important intellectual in the world and so on comes from a publisher's blurb, and you also always got to watch those things, because if you go back to the original, you'll find that that sentence is actually there. This is in the New York Times. But the next sentence is, since that's the case, how can he write such terrible things about American foreign policy? And they never quote that point. But in fact, if it wasn't for that second sentence, I would begin to think that I'm doing something wrong. And I'm not joking about that. It's true that the emperor doesn't have any clothes, but the emperor doesn't like to be told it. And the emperor's lapdogs, like the New York Times, are not going to enjoy the experience if you do.
I have to ask you something. For many years in the Soviet Union, that expression, lapdog, wasn't the emperor's lapdog, it was the imperious lapdog, the lapdog of whatever.
To whom were they referring?
To bourgeois newspapers, which would of course include the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the others. It kind of jars me to hear that same terminology used by a man like yourself. Now, you obviously you think about what you're saying. Would you care to qualify that when you call the New York Times a lapdog of the emperor who has no
Well, for example, as I would not compare the New York Times to the party hacks who wrote for Pravda, certainly for various reasons. For one thing, it's more diverse and it's more independent, and it's certainly not under anything like the same government pressure. On the other hand, if you look at the output, there are often remarkable similarities. And in fact, one of the differences between totalitarian states and free societies is that in totalitarian states, when the commissar class, shines the shoes of the people in power, they can at least plead fear. They can say, look, I'm afraid, I can't do anything else. In free societies, you can't plead fear, you can only plead cowardice. That's a difference too.
Go ahead. Well, let me just, in the Soviet Union, the media were controlled. And we all knew it. There was a department in the Central Committee of the Communist Party called the Department of Agitation Propaganda, later just a propaganda department, and you got your orders. This is what you're going to say about this. How you say it is your business, but this is the line. And every single publication in the country, every single television, every single radio, they followed this line. They were all controlled. But the way you tend to portray the press in this country, at least the mainstream press, seems to be pretty similar. It looks like they're all doing the same thing, and they're all controlled some way.
Well, that's it. They have to distinguish this.
All right.
In fact, they're all doing the same thing pretty much, but they're not controlled the same way. I mean, there are many different mechanisms that can lead to similar consequences. First of all, again, let me stress the consequences aren't identical. I mean, the variety in the United States is considerably greater, and the independence is certainly greater. The mechanisms of control are totally different. I mean, the mechanisms of control, if you want to call it that, in the United States are a kind of guided free market. You know, people they're responding to pressures that have to do with concentration of power and concentration of resources and need for advancement and so on and so forth. And you can spell these things out, they're not very subtle. But what's interesting is the uniformity of the consequence. So you say that let's take two invasions, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan and the American invasion of South Vietnam. Now, in the Soviet Union, incidentally, it was recognized as a Russian invasion of Afghanistan, even in the press, but it was defended. because you had to go into Afghanistan.
Never used as the word invasion was never used.
Well, actually, there was one famous initially, but by the early 80s it was already being used. In fact, there was a famous, yeah, okay. Now, so a couple of years, within a few years, I mean, it was being used. However, the line that was coming down from the Agitprop Bureau is it's a defense of Afghanistan against terrorists supported by the CIA and the imperialists.
You were asked to come in and help.
Told to tell
There's a limited force.
Now, let's take the United States. The United States invaded South Vietnam, attacked South Vietnam in certainly no later than 1962. That's when John F. Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnamese villages, authorized the use of napalm, sent American forces into combat situations and so on. That's an invasion, okay? Then the invasion built up into a huge attack on all of Indochina. All right, that's now, what, 31 years? I'm waiting to find some phrase, one phrase in the American press, one, no, I'm not asking for a lot, one phrase in the whole mainstream press that refers to such an event as the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam. I can't find it. What you find is, uniformly, the American defense of South Vietnam, maybe unwise, against terrorists supported from the outside. Word-by-word paraphrase of what the Agitprop Bureau told them. Now, nobody told them that in the United States. Like, they didn't get an order from the government saying that's the way you got to describe it. But nevertheless, that's what the output is. You take a look. I mean, you mentioned Anthony Lewis before. He was a critic of the war by 1969 or so.
And he never called it an invasion?
No, he said that the United States, in 1969, a year after Wall Street turned against the war and told Johnson to cut it off, Anthony Lewis was writing about how the war began with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969 it had turned into a disaster, mainly for us. Well, you know, I mean, I'm sure there were people in the Politburo who were saying that after a couple of years. Started out with blundering efforts to do good in Afghanistan, but within a few years we saw it was a disaster. I mean, it wouldn't have been a difficult thing for someone to write in Pravda by, you know, 1984, say. Now, we're talking...
Easier by 1985.
Okay, and easier by 85 after Gorbachev came in, sure.
Yes.
But, so now here the mechanisms are radically different. Incidentally, I only mention Anthony Lewis because you mentioned him. And scholarship was the same. So, for example, in the academic world, it would have been hard to find someone more critical of U.S. policy in Asia than John King Fairbanks, the dean of American Asian scholars. He was considered virtually a communist, you know. Well, he was president of the American Historical Association in 1968, and in December he gave his presidential address, which of course was partly about Vietnam, and he said that we got into Vietnam in an excess of benevolence and disinterested kindness or something like that. But we misunderstood the relation to China, and it was sort of analytical error. The American business community had turned against the war. What about in the years up to that, there was just support for it.
But these are not people speaking because they've been told to say
absolutely.
It. They believe it.
Exactly. So
Well,
I'm saying
important.
the mechanisms are totally different.
Right.
It's the output that is astonishingly similar. Now, what are the mechanisms? Well, then you want to look at them.
Well, let's give you a chance to... the mechanisms might include General Electric.
Yeah.
The multinational corporation that owns the cable channel on which Professor Chomsky shares his views with us today. We presume that our program will make it to the airwaves without censorship.
And hopefully we will be back.
And we'll be back in just a moment.